disrespectful child. You will not speak to me that way. I have had enough of your disrespect. You did that?
You did it first.
Nobody saw that slap coming. But to understand how a quiet woman like Bisola ended up slapping the most feared landlady in the entire compound, we have to go back there 3 months earlier. Mama Titi was 60 years old and had the kind of body that announced her presence before she even spoke. She was short, broad, chubby, and always dressed as if she had just finished attending a meeting where somebody had annoyed her. Her wrappers were usually tied tightly around her waist. Her blouses were always colorful, and her voice did not need an introduction. If Mama Titi shouted from the ground floor, tenants on the 3rd floor knew exactly what had happened. Sometimes they did not even need to know what had happened. They simply knew Mama Titi was angry. The compound belonged to her, and Mama Titi did not believe that owning a compound meant merely collecting rent. To her, the compound was a country, she was the president, the tenants were citizens, the water tank was a national resources, the clothesline was government property, and the compound gate, that was an international border. Nobody entered or left without Mama Titi knowing. Mama Titi knew who fetched water in the morning. She knew who cooked with too much smoke. She knew who washed clothes on Tuesday instead of Thursday. She knew which tenant's children played football near her flower pots. She knew who came home late. She knew who had visitors. She knew who had visitors that stayed too long. Her husband, Titi, had long ago accepted that silence was the safest way to remain married. Whenever Mama Titi started an argument, Titi quietly removed himself from the area. Whenever she returned from fighting with a tenant, he would look up from whatever he was doing and ask, "Have you eaten?" That was how he had survived 35 years of marriage. So, on the morning Bisola arrived, Mama Titi was sitting outside the building when the moving van stopped at the gate. The driver horned once. Mama Titi looked up. Then she looked at the van. Then she looked at the young men who began carrying furniture inside. Finally, she looked at the woman who stepped out after them. Bisola was 30 years old. She was calm, well-dressed, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent enough years living alone to know exactly what she wanted. She looked around the compound once, then she walked towards Mama Titi. "Good morning, ma." Mama Titi looked her up and down. "I am Bisola. I spoke with you about the vacant apartment." Bisola smiled politely. "I've come to move in." Mama Titi glanced towards the moving van. Mama Titi did not move. Instead, she pointed toward the furniture. "You people should be careful with that wardrobe, and nobody should scratch my walls, and don't allow them to make noise." Bisola glanced at the men carrying a large sofa through the gate. Mama Titi continued, "This is a quiet compound. No loud music, no unnecessary visitors." Bisola paused slightly. Mama Titi noticed. "Something wrong?" "No, ma." "Good." "And the water?" Mama Titi continued. "We fetch water in the morning before 8. Clothes are washed on certain days. Don't hang clothes anyhow. Visitors don't sleep over without informing me." Bisola looked at her for a moment, then she nodded. Mama Titi leaned back in her chair. That was when she smiled. It was not a large smile. It was a small, satisfied smile of a woman who had just discovered that a new tenant was unlikely to give her trouble. Bisola simply did not like trouble. There was a difference. For the first few weeks, everything went smoothly. Bisola went to work in the morning and returned in the evening. She greeted the older tenants. She did not play loud music. She did not quarrel with anybody. And whenever Mama Titi found a reason to complain, Bisola simply listened. That was what made Mama Titi like her, at least at first. The first real problem began with the clothesline. Bisola had washed her clothes on a Saturday morning and hung them neatly on the line. By afternoon, Mama Titi came out of her apartment and stopped. She looked at the clothes, then she looked at Bisola's apartment, then she looked at the clothes. Bisola! Bisola appeared at the balcony. Yes, ma. Calm down. Bisola came down. Mama Titi pointed at the clothesline. What is this? Bisola looked at the clothes. My clothes. Who told you to hang them there? Bisola looked at the line. Isn't this where everybody hangs clothes? Mama Titi slowly turned toward her. Mama Titi pointed toward the other end of the line. Your clothes should be there. And don't hang your clothes close to mine. Bisola looked at the clothesline. Mama Titi's clothes were nowhere near it, but Bisola simply nodded. She began removing the clothes Mama Titi washed. The tenants watched Mama Titi watching Bisola, and Bisola, who had no interest in spending a Saturday arguing over a clothesline, moved the clothes. That evening, one of the older tenants found her in the corridor. You are patient too. Bisola smiled. It's just clothes. The woman looked towards Mama Titi's apartment. Today it is clothes. Bisola said nothing. The woman continued. Tomorrow, she may decide that your slippers are facing the wrong direction. Bisola laughed. But the woman did not. That was the first time Bisola began to understand that Mama Titi's rules were not really about water or clothes or visitors. The rules were about control. And once Mama Titi discovered that a person would obey one small rule to avoid trouble, she immediately began looking for the next one. And then, on Friday evening, a black car stopped outside the gate. Bisola had just returned from work when a man stepped out of the driver's seat. He was tall, well-dressed and carrying a small gift bag. Bisola saw him and smiled. Mama Titi's eyes narrowed. Bisola suddenly remembered. Kule, this is Mama Titi, the landlady. Kule turned. Oh, good evening, ma. Mama Titi looked at him. Good evening. That was all. But as Bisola led Kunle toward her apartment, Mama Titi watched them. Kunle began visiting regularly. He never made noise. He did not disturb anybody. He packed properly. He greeted the older tenants. He even helped Papa Titi carry a heavy bag one afternoon. In other words, he was the kind of visitor nobody had a legitimate reason to complain about, which was exactly the problem because Mama Titi wanted to complain. One Saturday afternoon, Bisola's phone rang while she was getting ready to spend the day with Kunle. It was work. There was a problem at the office and they needed her attention immediately. Kunle was already on his way. Bisola called him before he arrived and explained that she had to leave. Kunle offered to go with her, but she quickly refused. She would handle the problem and return. Then Kunle said he would wait for her at her apartment. Bisola paused. Her eyes moved toward the compound. She already knew who she was thinking about, Mama Titi. But after a long sigh, she told him to come. Bisola left for work. After 30 minutes later, Kunle arrived. He greeted a few tenants as he entered the compound, then walked towards Bisola's apartment. Mama Titi was sitting outside. Of course, she saw him. She watched him approach, watched him greet her, and watched him explain that Bisola had gone to work. Then came the question she had been waiting for. If Bisola was not at home, why had he come? Kunle explained that Bisola had asked him to wait for her. Mama Titi leaned back and smiled. It was a calm smile, the kind of smile that made people uncomfortable before they even knew why. She did not accuse Bisola of anything. She did not call her a cheat. Instead, she simply mentioned that Kunle was not the only man who visited Bisola. That was all it took. Kunle's expression changed. Mama Titi noticed, so she pretended she had said too much. She tried to wave the subject away, but Kunle was no longer interested in letting it go. Who was the man? Why had he visited more than once? Why had he stayed so long? Mama Titi acted reluctant. She sighed. She hesitated. She even reminded Kunle that Bisola was his fiancée. And that was what made everything sound believable. Because Mama Titi did not invent an entirely new story, but simply took pieces of the truth and removed the parts that explained them. Yes, Bisola had once been seen talking to a man outside the compound. Yes, the man had visited more than once. Yes, he had stayed for a while. What Mama Titi did not mention was that the man was Bisola's cousin. She did not mention that he had come to help Bisola move a heavy cabinet, and she certainly did not mention that she had heard Bisola introduce him. Instead, she gave Kunle the version that sounded suspicious. Then she looked at him with the expression of a woman who had spent decades watching people. She told him to open his eyes, and after planting the idea, she walked away, leaving Kunle standing there with a doubt he had not arrived with. 2 hours later, Bisola returned from work. Kunle was still sitting outside her apartment, but something had changed. She noticed it immediately. He no longer looked at her the way he had looked at her that morning. His answers were short. His eyes kept moving away from hers. And when she asked what was wrong, he insisted that nothing was wrong. But the problem with saying nothing is wrong while looking like something is wrong is that people usually notice. Kunle soon stood up to leave. Bisola looked at him. Then she looked towards Mama Titi's apartment. The door was closed, but somehow Bisola already knew. She asked Kunle what Mama Titi had said to him. He said nothing, and that silence answered her. Bisola turned toward the apartment. Kunle reached for her hand. He tried to stop her, but Bisola pulled away. This time, she was not going to ignore it. Mama Titi appeared. She looked at Bisola, then she looked past her at Kunle and smiled. That smile was enough. Bisola asked what she had told her fiancé. Mama Titi immediately acted confused, then offended. In less than a minute, the conversation had changed from what Mama Titi had told Kunle to the way Bisola was speaking to her. That was Mama Titi's favorite escape route. Whenever she was cornered, she changed the subject. Bisola was not having it. She accused her of making Kunle believe that her cousin was another man. Mama Titi denied lying. She insisted that she had only warned Kunle to be careful. But Bisola knew exactly what she had done, and for the first time since moving into the compound, she was not trying to avoid Mama Titi. She had come looking for it. Mama Titi noticed, so she did what she always did when somebody finally challenged her. She made the problem about herself. Suddenly, Bisola was the disrespectful tenant. Suddenly, Bisola had been difficult since the first day she moved in. Suddenly, the clothesline, the water tap, the late nights, and every other disagreement became evident that Bisola had always been the problem. Bisola stared at her. Then she reminded Mama Titi that she had controlled almost everything since the day she moved into the compound. When she fetched water, when she hung her clothes, who visited her, what time she returned home, but interfering in her relationship was different. That was not Mama Titi's compound. That was Bisola's life. Mama Titi's face hardened. Then she pointed towards Bisola's apartment. She told her to pack out. The compound went quiet. Bisola stared at her. Mama Titi repeated herself, pack out. Bisola did not move, so Mama Titi stepped closer. The argument grew louder. Bisola demanded that Mama Titi apologize to Kunle. Mama Titi's face tightened. Her hand rose. The tenant saw it. Patiti saw it. Kunle saw it. But nobody moved quickly enough. A sharp sound cracked through the compound. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. For 1 second, Bisola stood completely still. Then she slowly turned her face back toward Mama Titi. Another sharp sound echoed through the compound. Mama Titi's head turned. The entire compound froze. Nobody spoke, not even Papa Titi. Mama Titi slowly turned her face back. Her eyes were wide, not because of the pain, because for the first time in her life, somebody had returned her own behavior to her. She touched her cheek, then stared at Bisola. "You did that." Bisola's chest rose and fell as she stood her ground. "You did it first." Mama Titi looked around the compound. The tenants were frozen. Kunle stood beside Bisola, speechless. Patiti stared at his wife, and for the first time since Bisola had moved into the compound, Mama Titi had no command to give. The compound remained silent. Mama Titi looked around. She expected somebody to defend her. She expected one of the tenants to shout at Bisola. She expected somebody to say, "How can you slap Mama Titi?" But nobody said anything. The tenants were too shocked, and perhaps deep down, a few of them were trying very hard not to laugh. Mama Titi noticed her face changed. "Everybody should go inside." Nobody moved. Mama Titi shouted longer. "I said everybody should go inside." That was when the tenants suddenly remembered that they had homes. One disappeared behind a curtain. Another picked up his bucket and walked away. A woman who had been standing on the balcony suddenly lowered herself out of sight. But the damage had already been done. Everybody had seen it, and everybody would talk about it. Mama Titi turned to Bisola. "You will pack out of this compound today." Bisola looked at her. "Fine." Bisola turned and walked inside. Mama Titi stood there, stunned. She had expected Bisola to cry. She had expected her to beg. She had not expected her to simply pack her things and leave. And the worst part was that everybody had seen it. By evening, the story had changed. According to one tenant, Mama Titi had slapped Bisola 3 times. According to another, Bisola had slapped her so hard that Mama Titi nearly fell. By night, a third version had appeared. Someone claimed that Mama Titi and Bisola had fought for 10 minutes. None of it was true, but the truth was already dramatic enough. Mama Titi had slapped Bisola, and Bisola had slapped her back. The story spread through the neighborhood before Bisola had even finished packing. At the market, people were whispering. At the salon, people were laughing. Even in the next compound, somebody was already asking, "Is this the woman Mama Titi slapped?" Mama Titi soon discovered that the slap had traveled faster than she did. Everywhere she went, people suddenly became quiet. Some looked at her cheek, some looked away, and some simply smiled. Bisola left the compound a few days later. As for Mama Titi, she remained in her compound. The water was still hers, the clothesline was still hers, the tenant were still living under her roof. But things were different now, because whenever Mama Titi raised her voice, somebody remembered the sound that had echoed across the compound that afternoon. Slap. And suddenly, the most feared woman in the compound was no longer quite so frightening, because everybody had learned something. Mama Titi could control the water, she could control the clothesline, she could control who entered the compound, but she could not control Bisola, and she certainly could not control the story of the slap. Sometimes, the person you spend your entire life trying to control is the person who finally teaches you to mind your own business. Tell me in the comments, did the landlady, Mama Titi, deserve the slap? Should Bisola have reacted like that by slapping Mama Titi? Let us know. Thank you for watching. I appreciate. Please subscribe to this channel